Welcome back, everyone. We've been looking at reasons why or factors that led to European exploration, reasons why they started searching beyond their own borders, seeking out new places, going new places, seeking out new things. And we talked about how the Portuguese were the first ones to really get that started, and that it was the desire for luxury goods from Asia that caused them to start going on those expeditions and voyages. But where we left it last time, we talked about how the Spanish eventually got in on it. Rivalry between countries was a big factor that led to all of this. And it was very much Spain's desire to catch up to Portugal, to outdo Portugal, that leads them to take a chance on somebody like Columbus, who had a little bit of a different idea about how to get around Africa, or rather that you didn't have to go around Africa. And that, of course, resulted in his quote unquote discovery of the Americas and the soon Spanish conquest of the Americas. So what we want to look at today is talk about Spanish conquest of the Americas in a very, very small scale. And that way we'll be able to compare it later on when we get to the English. Most of the study of European colonization that we're going to do will have to do with English colonization. But that's what we'll focus on all in chapter 2. What we want to look at today is get a little glimpse of what it was like, the Spanish version of this, and we're also going to hit on the French towards the end of this as well. So let's get into talking about how and why, and kind of a particular case study here of how the Spanish came in and swiftly took over and began to exploit and settle land in the Americas. So whereas the Portuguese were the first to really explore, it is the Spanish that are the first to, there's that word again, quote unquote, discover the Americas and start colonizing in the Americas and claim a vast empire in the Americas. Now, Portugal is going to claim land in the Americas as well, and we'll also, of course, see it later with England and France. But Spain is the leader in this, and this is where at some point in the 1500s, they will surpass Portugal and amass a huge empire and become the most powerful country in the world, certainly the most powerful country in Europe, due to their exploits in the Americas. So the way that they do this, and the Spanish become certainly the most infamous for their exploits in the Americas. There's not really maybe one slight exception, I'll get to that later. But when it comes to Europeans and their encounter in the Americas and the story that we get about how they did that, most European powers won't get very much of a good reputation when it comes to that. It is a reputation of coming in and taking over people and stealing from them and killing them and disrupting their way of life. It can be quite ugly. But of all European powers, none seems to have a worse reputation than the Spanish. And some of that is, or a lot of that is certainly quite warranted because of their actions. Some of that was also a little bit exaggerated. Well, not exaggerated to the extent that what they were saying wasn't true, but a lot of it is other European countries saying, well, the Spanish were way worse than us. Everything that we're doing is not as bad as what they did. So some of that, again, not exaggerated until they say things aren't true, but they, the English, the French, others will use the Spanish as kind of an example to sort of say, at least we weren't as bad as they were. So let's take a look at some of the reasons why that is. When we think about the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the people that should come to mind are these people known as conquistadors. And you probably notice that word conquistador looks like the English word conqueror, and that's what it means. A conquistador, these were Spanish conquerors. These were the Spanish military entrepreneurs. That means that they were military guys. They were kind of in the employ of the Spanish government. They certainly, were acting on behalf of the Spanish government, but they're also acting on behalf of themselves, because whatever they take over, whatever riches they get, whatever wealth they plunder, they get to keep part of it. Then part of it goes to the government, to the Spanish crown, and some of it will be for themselves. And they're claiming these lands for Spain, but then they get to kind of rule over them and be, the head man in charge of all of them, in the name of the Spanish government. So they're kind of partially interested for their own wealth and their own advantage, but they're also acting on behalf of their government. So this was a way for Spain to kind of finance a lot of this. So these conquistadors get this reputation for being incredibly brutal, for being incredibly swift, for coming in and just wiping away Native American cultures, many of which had been around for centuries. There are numerous conquistadors, but the one that we're going to look at kind of as a case study for the others, we're not going to go through all of the Spanish conquistadors and all of the Native American civilizations that they conquered. We're going to look at this one, who becomes certainly the ultimate example, becomes the most infamous and well-known of the Spanish conquistadors, and that is Hernan Cortez. And Hernan Cortez is going to become incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy over his exploits in the Americas because he happens to conquer the wealthiest and the most powerful Native American empire that there was. And of course, that's going to be the Aztecs that we talked about in section 1. So Cortez, with his just a couple of hundred soldiers, is exploring around, poking around in Central America, and through communicating and talking with other Native American groups, starts to hear about this fabulously wealthy, almost doesn't even sound real kind of Native American civilization that was somewhere in what we would today call Mexico. And of course, he's very interested in gaining that. So he works his way close to Aztec territory. At the same time, he is gathering recruiting, as it were, more enemies of the Aztecs. Remember, the Aztecs are like a military empire. They themselves were seen by a lot of other Native Americans as the bad guys. They were ruling over, they were demanding taxes of people they were ruling over. So some of those people might have seen Cortez and his men as a way out of that. So that's how Cortez will get a lot of help. So he makes his way into Tenochtitlan. Remember, that's the capital city. And they are, of course, dazzled by everything that they see. And remember that Tenochtitlan was larger than any European city. They've never seen anything like this. And of course, they're dazzled by the gold and the jewels and all of those things. They're also very taken aback. This looks extremely different than any European city. They're particularly horrified by some of the Aztec customs, particularly things like human sacrifice. But they work their way in. At first, they are welcomed in. The Aztec leaders, Aztec priests, the Aztec emperor thought they were gods. There were gods that they worshipped, and there were stories in their religious culture that told of gods returning to earth and all of these things. And they at first assumed that Cortez and his men were those gods. They were also impressed and scared because the Spanish had weapons and they looked different and they had armor and all these things that they weren't so sure about. So first they allowed Cortez in. They gave him what they wanted. They gave him money. They gave him jewels. They gave him gifts, all these things to try to win his favor, will please you, please don't kill us, all that kind of stuff. Eventually there's a rebellion. The Aztecs throw Cortez and his men out, but that doesn't last very long because in the meantime, Cortez continues to recruit more and more enemies of the Aztecs. He's regrouping. He gathers lots of forces till he's got about 20,000 at his side now, in addition to those couple of hundred Spanish he came with originally. And disease works in his favor. We've talked in the past about disease and how that devastated and weakened Native American populations, and that's exactly what happens here. A smallpox epidemic runs through the city and the empire for the Aztecs, and Cortez uses that as the opportune moment, and with his thousands of not only his own people but thousands of enemies of the Aztecs, they destroy Tenochtitlan. They surround it, they lay siege to it. The illness causes a lot of death and destruction, and then Cortez comes in and destroys Tenochtitlan, and they kill the emperor, and the Aztecs are taken over. Thousands of them destroyed by disease, more of them killed in battle, and Cortez wipes out. The Aztecs surrender, and he wipes out in about 2 years what had been a massive empire of probably about 1 million people that took centuries to develop. So it is something that happens super quick because of so many factors that worked against Native Americans. And from there, the Spanish continue to claim more and more land. There are other conquistadors that, seeing Cortez's example and seeing how fabulously wealthy he became, that want to follow in those footsteps. And there were certainly hopes and beliefs for a very long time that there were other Aztec empires out there, that there were other fabulously wealthy Native American empires out there to be exploited. There were some that kind of came a little bit close to the Aztecs, but nowhere near as wealthy as the Aztecs. And you can read later, and probably did in the summer assignment, I think, about some of the others like Pizarro, who took over the Incas in South America, and Coronado, that was in this area, what would today be the southwestern portion of the United States, North America, looking for this, supposed lost city of gold. You have Ponce de Leon that captures Florida, so forth and so on. So over the next many, many years, numerous conquistadors coming through the Americas to claim and destroy more Native American empires. And these maps show you by about, and this one obviously is labeled 1780, so much later. Cortez is about 1519. This one, all the red here shows you Spanish America, the land that the Spanish would eventually claim. You can see that it covers a good portion of North America. It covers almost all of Central America, a big part of the Caribbean, and a large part of South America. This one shows you, like I said, 1780. So this one shows you, just after the American Revolution, really, are getting close to it. Or in the middle of it, actually, is when that's going on. But you can see here, again, this would eventually become French, so that you can see some differences in these maps. This would be Portuguese, that sort of thing. So it changes around from time to time, so it kind of depends on the year you're looking. But overall, you can see the vast empire that the Spanish eventually claimed. So there are numerous other conquistadors. We're just going to say some of their names and mention very, very briefly the areas that they took over. Pizarro took over the Incas in South America, and they were pretty powerful and wealthy, probably next to the Aztecs. I think you could say that was one of the more powerful Native American empires. Coronado was the one I mentioned a moment ago in the Southwest, what would today be southwestern North America, looking for that supposed lost city of gold. Again, there's all these myths that arrive after all of this about wealth and such in the New World. Hernando de Soto might be a familiar name because De Soto lies in De Soto Caverns in Childersburg, not too far from here. He explored through the Mississippi River region, parts of Alabama, thus the name De Soto Caverns around the Childersburg area. Not a whole lot of claiming land for Spain on a permanent basis, but did a lot of exploration and a lot of ugly encounters with Native Americans. Juan Ponce de Leon claimed Florida for the Spanish. We have Spanish Florida for quite some time. He's another one that was looking for one of these kind of mystical, magical things, looking for a supposed fountain of youth. But from there, we get that image that we just saw a moment ago of this vast Spanish empire. Now, as well as we can easily say that for the Spanish, a big motivation for theirs, of course, is money and wealth and riches and all of those things. That is a huge motivator for them, that wealth and that power. But another big motivator for the Spanish, another thing that they would certainly say was a big part of why they were doing what they were doing, was about religion. We kind of hit on in the previous section how much religion, whether it is spreading a religious faith or seeking religious freedom, how that has a big effect. That's a big factor into why people want to come to the New World. The spread of their religion, particularly Catholicism, Spain was and remains to this day a very Catholic nation. That was the official state religion, and they saw it as part of their agenda to spread the Catholic faith. And so that was a very big part of their pattern of colonization. They would claim that part of the reason for taking over Native Americans and why they were justified in taking over Native Americans, why it was okay to do what they did, was because they were spreading the Catholic faith, that the Native Americans needed to be ruled over, that they deserved to be ruled over because they were not Catholic, because they needed to be shown the right way, and that this is what their faith dictated, and that made them superior, and that made it okay for them to do what they did. So it is very much used as justification for a lot of that brutality. And I think you can also make the case used to cover up a lot of that brutality and a lot of those things that were done that were, not very nice at all, and used as a reason why it was okay to destroy Native American cultures. It's heathen, it's savage. We can destroy this beautiful artwork. We can destroy these temples and build Catholic cathedrals on top of them, because we're justified and, called by God to do this. So the religion is a part of a lot of European patterns of colonization, but it's with the Spanish where it's really used so heavily as a means of not only doing what they did, but justifying what they did. And it also brings us to just a characteristic of Spanish colonization. A lot of Spanish missionaries were priests and missionaries, Spanish settlers were missionaries and priests that went over there to, minister to Native Americans. Many of those people meaning well. I don't mean to say that every one of those, because you're going to read in some assignments about some of these priests and missionaries that, didn't like all of the aggression and didn't think it was right to do some of the things they were doing, although they did want to spread the Catholic faith. So a lot of what you have in the Spanish colonies are Catholic missions and places to conduct that missionary work and try to convert Native Americans to Christianity. Now, this also brings us to some of the reasons why, and we should have seen this kind of evident when we just talking about Cortez's example and even just thinking about some of the others. We said that these were quite powerful Native American empires, some of which had stood for thousands of years. The Spanish were greatly outnumbered here. You're talking about, a couple of hundred or maybe a couple of thousand Spaniards standing up to Native American empires that might number as high as 1 million. So how is it possible that they were able to come in and really in just a matter of 2 years change everything? Well, the reasons for that are probably pretty evident through the discussion that was just had. One of the things there, of course, is technology. The Spanish, although smaller in numbers, had firearms, they had guns, they had armor, they had horses, they had that technology that was much more advanced and weaponry that was much more advanced than spears and bows and arrows and knives and things that Native Americans were most likely using. Disease cannot be understated. I think you could probably make the case that that's probably the number one reason, because Native Americans were so devastated and so badly affected by all that disease. We saw that specifically with Cortez's example, that they weren't able to fight back. That killed off a lot of them. That made them weak. And as I've said earlier, there are plenty of Native American empires or civilizations that we may not even really even know about, that might have been wiped out by diseases before Europeans ever even really got close to them. And so they didn't have to go after those people. That happens. There are cases of that happening in North America for sure. So disease cannot be understated as probably one of the main reasons why that happens. Another reason is division. We kind of saw that, but haven't really articulated it very well. We tend to sometimes today think of Native Americans as all being together. They're all Native Americans. It's like one group of people. We forget that there are thousands of Native American cultures, that they had rivalries of their own. They had enemies of their own. It's not like it's all the Native Americans together working against European colonization. That's never the case. They are divided, they are fragmented, and that makes them kind of easy targets. We saw Cortez do that. Some of the people that helped him fight were Native Americans that he recruited to fight with him. And Europeans that is, can always turn Native American groups against each other. They can work on them one at a time. So that lack of cohesion, that lack of working together, being able to put aside some of their differences to fight this common enemy, that's going to continue to be a problem for Native Americans. Because as you can probably guess, if you haven't already, this isn't the first time, or rather this isn't the only time that we're going to talk about Native American resistance. This is going to be a continuing thing for us throughout the school year. We'll even get into it a little bit in 11th grade. Where you're talking about, when you're talking about, exactly what people you're talking about changes, but this concept that Native Americans are trying to hang on to their land, trying to preserve their culture, trying to preserve their way of life, and then you have other people, whether they're Europeans or Americans or whoever, that don't want them to do that, or that see them as an obstacle that they got to get rid of so they can use their land and all those things. That doesn't go away. And the fact that Native Americans are not united will constantly be a problem. Later in the year, we will talk about some attempts by Native Americans to become more united, some that recognize that problem and said, we got to work together, but nothing ever really comes of it long term. Now, we need to switch gears a little bit here, and here we're going definitely out of chronological order, but talking about another European power and their pattern of colonization, which looks remarkably different from the Spanish. Now, we're going to spend, like I said, most of our time on English colonization, which we'll look at in Chapter 2. So what we're going to look at right now is the French and talk a little bit about French colonization. Now, again, we're stepping way out of chronological order here because whereas the Spanish are the first to really amass a big empire in the Americas, which they do probably around the 1500s, the French are the latecomers. And it is not until way later in the 1600s, really, that they get started with this. And in the meantime, the English are kind of somewhere in the middle. So let's talk a little bit about French colonization. Again, the French are the latecomers. The French are kind of the last of the major European powers to start coming to North America by that time because Central and South America had already been taken by that point. So they will basically be in North America. And the French just simply were not powerful enough, not well organized enough, not financially secure enough, and too involved in their own internal struggles, mostly religious struggles, prior to that to do any of this. So while Spain was off conquering the Aztecs and all those kind of things, the French were still squabbling amongst themselves if they were going to be Catholic or Protestant or whatever. So that kind of delayed their colonization efforts. Now, the French are later, and the French also differ greatly in what their main motivation was. Whereas with the Spanish, we saw their main motivation being religion and gold and wealth and treasure and riches and all those things. With the French, it's a little bit simpler. It's the fur trade. The thing that attracts the French to the Americas is the fur trade, the trapping of animals and the trading of their pelts, beaver pelts and other kinds of animals, foxes and so forth. That is what attracted them there. And the fur trade was something that was already going on. That was something that Native Americans had done for centuries and continue to do. And that's going to have a very big impact on the way that the French conduct themselves in those colonies. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So they were, the first French settlers are fur trappers and merchants and traders, and therefore they're not coming over in huge, huge numbers. There's not near as many of them. There are two major French explorers, not exactly conquistadors when it came to the French, but people that explored for France and sort of claimed some of the first major French land claims and therefore colonies in North America. The first of those was Samuel de Champlain, and he would claim for France what would become their colony of Quebec. Quebec is today a province of Canada. So we're talking about North America and what would today be Canada. And into parts of that would include what would today be parts of the United States even. So the boundary is not quite the same. But the first French colony would be Quebec. And if you know anything about that part of Canada, they do speak French in the Canadian province of Quebec. A lot of people are actually bilingual, speaking both French and English. You may hear about an area or a thing being French Canadian. That has to do with the French influence there. So they have Quebec, and that is their first colony, quite large, but not hugely populated. And then French colonization kind of slows down, and there's really not a whole lot of effort by the French to colonize or to settle or to claim new lands and those kind of things for quite some time. And then there's kind of a second wave of French colonization that comes a little bit later. And the second of your major French explorers is Robert de la Salle. Robert de la Salle explores, see, here's Quebec, this area right in here. This would be Canada and all on the Great Lakes region. Some of this does include, you see here, what would today be the United States. And then you have Robert de la Salle that comes later in the 1600s. He is going to explore the Mississippi River region, which is what I'm tracing right here. And he is going to claim all of that land, all of this, and that becomes your second French colony of Louisiana. Louisiana named for the French king, King Louis the 14th specifically. So all of this green becomes New France by, and this map is dated 1700. So this part would be Quebec, this would be Louisiana. Now remember, today we would think of Louisiana as being the modern day state of Louisiana, which would be right here. But when you're talking about the French colony of Louisiana, you mean all of this. So you can see that it's quite large. These are the British colonies, which we'll get to in chapter 2. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what made the French really, really different and how that's related to some of the things we're talking about just a moment ago. One way that the French really, really stand out and are very different than any of their other European counterparts has to do with their relationship with Native Americans. Whereas the Spanish get a terrible reputation for cruelty, the English do not have a very good reputation with that as well. The French, for the most part, got along with Native Americans. They tended to be allies with Native Americans. There are a few Native American groups that they didn't get along with, one really in particular called the Iroquois, which are located right in this area. But for the most part, the French and the Native Americans had a very peaceful relationship, a very cooperative relationship. That goes back partly to the reason why the French were there to begin with. Remember, the fur trade. The fur trade was something that Native Americans were already doing. So it was something that they engaged in with them. They needed Native Americans in order to conduct that fur trade. They saw Native Americans more as a partner rather than something that was in the way or people that were in the way and needed to be removed. So the French and the Native Americans more worked together. It was far more likely for the French to live amongst Native Americans, to associate with them, to learn their languages, to in some cases adopt at least parts of their culture, to intermarry with them. While that was done plenty of times in the Spanish and the French and Spanish and the English and all of that, it was far more common and far more accepted amongst French colonization. And another reason, and it all kind of relates to each other, why the French have that better relationship is because the French colonies grow very slowly. And by growth, I mean population growth. You'll notice that all this looks like a lot of land. You look at that and you go, oh, France has got just millions of people over there. They don't. There's not a huge wave of settlement. It's not like French people are just signing up to come live in Quebec and live in Louisiana. There's some, and there are some populated cities like Montreal and New Orleans and places like that. But the French just don't have these mass migrations coming over. Whereas when we get to the English or the British in chapter 2, there are mass migrations. There were so many different factors that were pulling people to those colonies. And therefore, if the French are not constantly having more and more people, that means they're not constantly taking over Native American land. They're not constantly encroaching upon Native American territory. They're not constantly trying to destroy Native American culture. So they are far less destructive to the Native American way of life. They are far more respectful of Native American culture. Now, were there missionaries and trying to reach out to Native Americans, all that stuff? Of course there were. Plenty of that. In fact, a lot of that's probably the second, whereas fur trapping is probably the number one thing that brought French people to the New World. The second thing is probably missionaries to convert Native Americans. But even then, they did it differently. They didn't just come in and say, we're going to tear down all your stuff and burn all your stuff. We're going to even teach this story to you, maybe in a way that you can understand it. Really interesting kind of stuff to look up there. So for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the French saw the Native Americans as an ally and the other way around. But as you can see, just to foreshadow things that are to come, notice that we've got several different European countries claiming parts of the New World, claiming parts of the Americas. So we can see that eventually that does lead to some conflict between those countries. So the French do things much differently, and what we'll be looking at, of course, in chapter 2 is what happens when the English get in on all of this, which they do partially to compete with their big rival Spain, not wanting to be outdone by Spain, and then we'll see a variety of reasons and a variety of people that will start trying to settle the New World. So we'll see you next time.